What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Here we are with another reaction, and in this one we got Jordan Peterson talking about the German problem. Before we dive in, if you happen to enjoy this video, make sure you don't forget to smash subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, see what the German problem's about.
So like a great many of my contemporaries, I was drawn to the study of 20th century history. The German problem, what Meinecke called the German catastrophe, is the hardest of all problems because the worst event, the Holocaust, arises in a quite advanced society, which had the best universities in the 1920s, which had the highest rates of intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews of any country, which was generally recognized to be at the forefront of technological and scientific advance, and yet Hitler, and yet the Holocaust. Wow. And so for me, the big challenge in my early career was to try to come up with a better answer than seemed to be available to the question, what went wrong? As a graduate student, I encountered a lot of, to me, unsatisfactory answers to this question, some of which derived loosely from the Marxist tradition. And so there was a lot of Marxian, if not Marxist, thinking that it must somehow be to do with the peculiarities of German class society. I won't bore you with the details. All this seemed to me to be profoundly misconceived. I found Meinecke's answer actually better. Meinecke, of course, lived through it, didn't leave Germany, and published Die Deutsche Katastrophe just after the end of the war. And in it, he advances a number of, I think, illuminating arguments, one of which is that the German elites became excessively technocratic and ethically uncoupled. And it's this ethic uncoupling that arises amongst the educated Germans that is the most striking feature, I think, of the story.
Why did they become ethically? Why? Oh.
See, I think I watched the video. I thought, and I guess the reason in that video was probably wrong, but kind of what I saw from the video was that it seemed like after World War I, Germany was being treated unfairly. And then the other countries really had no mercy. Like, they feel like Germany started this, so Germany was going to pay, Germany was going to disarm, they were going to do this, they were going to do that in Germany. And then that allowed a leader like Hitler, I guess, because I thought maybe the Germans felt like the rest of the world didn't care about them, so they were like, F the rest of the world. But that might be completely out the window with the information that I received in this video. And so so this is very different. It's saying Germany had the #1 society in the world. They seemed like the most technology advanced. They had the best of the universities. So how did this arise? So this should be a different perspective to look at it.
Most striking feature, I think, of the story.
Why did they become ethically? Why? Okay, so that's okay. So two questions there. It's like, why do you think you were dissatisfied? So as I progressed through my degree in political science, that was my first degree, I became increasingly dissatisfied with the explanations that were offered because they were always economic. It was like, well, these things happen because of power relations and economics. And I thought, well, you're missing something here because economics is embedded in the study of value, and it's not obvious why people value the things they're valuing. And so when you reduce the Second World War to an underlying economic conflict, let's say, you beg the question. It's like, well, people organize themselves economically in all sorts of different ways, so you're not getting at something fundamental. That's actually why I turned to psychology, and it was actually to address the German problem, which was the one that you just laid out. It's like, how could this spectacular civilization, sort of at the pinnacle of the West, go so cataclysmically wrong? I turned to psychological explanations for that, but why were you dissatisfied with the Marxist, let's say, deterministic analysis? Like, what was it about the way you looked at that made that not acceptable to you?
Well, you earlier on said it's not that surprising that Germany had this terrific political convulsion because of all the terrible things that had happened. And you didn't even complete the list because after the hyperinflation came the Great Depression, and Germany had a very severe collapse between 1929 and 32. The problem with purely economic explanations or socioeconomic explanations is that they can't explain why the United States, which has an equally bad depression to Germany, that the two major industrial economies suffer almost as big a shock, why the United States does not abandon democracy and does not abandon the rule of law and does not embrace the demonic ideas of racialism, which were available to all societies. One must remember that the ideas that Hitler came to believe, eugenics, for example, or anti-Semitism, they were open source. They were globally available. Anybody could believe these things because they had been very respectable in intellectual circles from really the turn of the century. So it's very hard to say that Germany had a much worse economic experience than any other countries, because countries all around the world experienced the Great Depression, and countries all around the world were exposed to the kind of ideas that Hitler had embraced. So you have to come up with some better explanation for the success of the National Socialist movement. And that success is partly, I think, explicable in terms of a collapse of political order, the loss of reputation of democracy as a system, partly as a result of the hyperinflation, and then the collapse of the established political parties, creating an opportunity for an entirely new kind of political movement, National Socialism, to sweep to power in the Depression. I don't think the kind of books I read as a graduate student came close to capturing the vital ingredient, and this is where we turn to Dostoevsky, namely the demonic nature of Adolf Hitler's appeal. And I think...
So this is interesting. I thought maybe Germany's economy was suffering more so than others, but no. They were actually... It sounds like the society was like amazing. Like they had a very, I guess, progressive society, I'll say, in a sense. They had the best universities and that of such. But through the Great Depression, I guess they really suffered through the Great Depression. However, they were not the only ones that suffered through the Great Depression. Many other countries suffered. And the United States suffered just as much as Germany did during the Great Depression. But the U.S. didn't abandon democracy. They didn't abandon law. They didn't abandon these things. They held on to these things. While over in Germany, a power vacuum, I guess, opened up in the politics for Germany, for Hitler to come in and spread these ideas that were already, like, everybody knew about these ideas. Anybody could have believed them in these many different countries, yet Hitler somehow came up to power in Germany with these ideas, and there were so many who followed him in these beliefs, which was absolutely tragic and absolutely terrible. But why? That's what they're trying to get to the bottom of. Why?
The demonic nature of Adolf Hitler's appeal. And I think that the great failure of structural functionist approaches was to try to write Hitler out of the script as if it would all have happened without him. I remember Hans Mommsen, one of the doyens of the historical profession in Germany, saying his ambition was to write a history of the Third Reich in which the name Hitler didn't appear. And that just struck me as the reductio ad absurdum of structuralist thinking. Without Hitler, it doesn't happen the way it does, because Hitler has an awful charisma and an ability to tap into demonic strains in German culture. That's critical. Very few historians have written about that. I'll give you one honorable mention. Michael Burley's New History of the Third Reich is, I think, the only book that captures the enormous power of Hitler as a demonic and charismatic leader, capable of displacing Christian ethics. And that is the critical thing. Hitler calls on German society to renounce Christian ethics.
Wow.
And that is why, by the early 1940s, educated German men are engaged in the kind of barbaric behavior that we associate with the Holocaust.
Okay, so Nietzsche calls out the death of God in the mid-1800s, and we can make the case that that process cascades most effectively through Germany, maybe with France as a second-order competitor. Now, here's how Carl Jung explained what happened.
Can I interrupt, Jordan? Because God was more thoroughly killed by the Bolsheviks than by any other regime. And it's actually very important that the great catastrophe of the Bolshevik Revolution happens first. At the heart of the great historical controversies of the 1980s was the extent to which Nazism should be understood as, in some measure, a reaction to Bolshevism. Although the historical profession ruled against Ernst Nolte, who made that argument, I think Nolte was onto something. You can't really understand the rise of Hitler until you've appreciated the calamity of Bolshevism beforehand.
See, and I have no idea about Bolshevism and what happened with the fall of that. So that might be something I need to, I guess, learn about to understand more about how the Nazism started and everything. So if anyone wants to explain that in a short summary, I'd love to read it. If not, I guess I'll try to figure it out.
As the holiday season unfolds, it's
I'm going to skip the sponsorship.
expressvpn.com/JordanYT to learn more.
Right. That strikes me as perfectly plausible. Okay, so now there's a profound spiritual unrest, let's say. Now, that's amplified by this sequence of catastrophes that we already described that befell Germany. Okay, so now you have Hitler, who's an individual that's particularly gifted as an orator. And so now I've talked to a lot of political leaders who are actual leaders. And one of the things that they do that makes them leaders is they listen. And if you listen to people, they tell you what their problems are, and then you can aggregate their problems. And if you listen to them, they'll tell you what sort of solutions they'd like to see, and you can aggregate those. But there's two ways you can go about it. So if you're a policeman and you grill a child about the sexual misbehavior of his teacher in the classroom, and you do that with enough seriousness, you can get perfectly healthy, unmolested children to come up with fantasies about mutilation and sexual misbehavior that are so brutal and all-encompassing, you'd have to believe they were real.
That's crazy.
And that's because the child's fantasy starts to manifest answers that would match the paranoia of the interlocutor, leading the witness, let's say. And so that's what accounted for the daycare sexual abuse scandals of the 1980s. But the same thing happened, this was Jung's argument, the same thing happened politically. So now you imagine you have this disaffected corporal who's got a gift for oration and who actually can pay attention. Now, he's resentful and wanting compensatory power. And now he starts to talk. And he notices that certain things he says elicit an emotional response from the crowd. And so the crowd starts to shape him. And he starts to enter into this dance with the crowd. And he becomes the repository of the unconscious, resentful, vengeance-seeking fantasies of the whole German Reich.
That's crazy. That's crazy. So Jordan Peterson more so takes a psychology perspective of it. And like he said with the school children, he said you can get the untouched, unmolested school children if the police officer drills into them, like all these things. You can get them to create fantasies to believe that they were molested, and they like leading the witness. They will make up scenarios in which seem so real that you have no choice but to believe them. And he talked about leaders. Great leaders are able to listen to your problems and then listen to how you want your problems to be solved. And it sounds like that's what Hitler did. He listened to their people's problems and he took advantage of that. He absolutely took advantage. So he knew what their problem was, took advantage. So when he spoke, he was talking about their problems, and that was able to elicit that emotion into where he gained a following. And that following was built upon, I feel like, frustration, anger, hatred. And so once he built that following, he knew exactly what to say to make people feel the type of way. Knew how to lead the witness.
And that vision, that hateful vision of destruction, ethnic purity and destruction, starts to make itself manifest within him, and then he reflects that back to the crowd. Wow. And when they become emotional about it, he hones the argument. So you could say Hitler targeted the evil that was lurking in the unconscious of the disaffected Germanic population. And he was willing to take that to its logical extreme. It propelled him, obviously, to great heights of power, right? So he was the ruler of that unconscious hell. Now, I read that, I read Jung's work pertaining to Hitler, and I thought, that's the best description I've ever seen of exactly how that horrible vision emerged and also why it had such power. You had this skill of Hitler to collect and to orate, combined with his absolute willingness to go wherever the impulsive crowd was prone to direct it. So what do you think of that idea?
Many historians naively draw a dichotomy between theories of history in which powerful individuals are dominant and theories in which structural forces are dominant. And this is a false dichotomy. What happens in Germany is that exceptional, charismatic orator emerges who's better at inflammatory speeches than any of the others in other countries. That's extraordinarily important. He has this indefinable charisma, this star quality, but at the same time, a social network of National Socialism spreads very rapidly through Germany from its embryonic state in the early 1920s to being an extraordinarily powerful movement by 1932-33.
That's crazy.
And that's not entirely down to Hitler. And this is a process we still don't understand very well. It's how Nazism goes viral, to use modern terminology. Of course, they didn't have the internet then. They had radios, they had cinemas, they had newspapers, but we can trace the viral spread of National Socialism as an ideology through the very rapid exponential growth of Nazi membership in the critical elections of the early 1930s. And you need both to explain this phenomenon. You used the Jungian term collective unconsciousness. No, I think Hitler articulated conscious fears and conscious causes of anger amongst Germans. It wasn't that unconscious. And the critical thing you have to do if you're trying to explain this to young people is you have to make them watch a Hitler speech. And you have to make them watch the whole thing. Because a Hitler speech was a performance of almost operatic duration. Nowadays, typically, it's very hard to find Hitler clips online. They've been to a large extent taken down compared with when I was teaching at Harvard, when you could get really quite long clips and show people. But it's very hard to get an entire speech. And if you don't have an entire speech, you don't see how it works.
Yeah, I was gonna say I've never seen like a full speech on here. I've never seen that.
And you don't see why the crescendo, which if you watch it in isolation seems mad, in context took the crowd to a fever pitch that we really haven't seen since. So demagogy is something we have to understand. We also have to understand that all societies have the propensity to be led into unfreedom. It is not some peculiarity of German society. As you hinted at earlier, it is possible for all free societies to be seduced by a demagogue and then kept in unfreedom by a fatal combination. Prosperity, that the Nazi economy was much more successful than the Weimar economy. Propaganda, Goebbels was a genius, an evil genius in this field. And then coercion. The regime became progressively more coercive over time. It used terror initially in a targeted way, by the end in a blanket way. And these three forces together can subjugate even the most advanced society. It is unfortunate that this lesson is not taught in more universities in North America and I would say throughout the Anglosphere, because we don't teach this. Unfortunately, a generation has arisen that doesn't understand when it engages in behavior that is at least susceptible to totalitarian leadership, seduction, and coercion.
I completely agree. I would have loved to learn about this here in North America. We don't really teach anything about this. And, they say if you forget history, it's doomed to repeat itself. And that's just not taught here. And I do believe in what he's saying. And like any society could fall into this. So we have to make people aware of what a leader like Hitler did in order to gain the following that he did, in order to play on people's feelings of hatred, in order to play on people's fears, in order to turn that and do what he did, create the evil that was Nazism. I feel like that has to be taught so you could be aware. And I think they do a great job of teaching it in Germany. I've reacted to many many YouTubers who kind of talked about the topic and talked about them growing up and them teaching about the Holocaust and them teaching about all these bad things of the past, and really being drilled into them so they know, and so now they don't repeat history. That's all we have. Let me know what you guys think about that video. They brought up very interesting topics, very valid points. They really went into psychology and everything. If you enjoyed, don't forget to subscribe, give the video a thumbs up. Check out the next one. I'll see you next time.